Hi guys, welcome back to another video at Jensen's Reptiles. Today we're actually going to be talking about an amphibian, not a reptile. We're going to be talking about Pacman frogs. This is my Pacman frog, Namco. Now, Pacman frogs come from South America and they span a really wide region, so you can find them all over. They get between 10 and 25 centimeters depending on how much they're fed and also if they're male or female. Enclosure wise, I have Namco in this 45 by 45 by 45 Habitat enclosure. This is quite an old enclosure. I don't think Habitat make these Habitat habitats anymore. I got mine from an exotic vet who was upgrading some of his frogs. So it made a fantastic home for Namco. Now, Pacman frogs aren't hugely active once they're out of that juvenile phase. So this size enclosure is probably all Namco will ever need. But when he was a juvenile, he was in a 30 by 30 by 30 centimeter cube, and that suited him just fine as well. Really easy to heat and provide the right lighting in either. But I would recommend, as your frog gets bigger, definitely increase the size of the enclosure so that when they do move around, they've got enough space to do so. For example, if Namco poops where he's currently sitting, he's going to want to move and dig another hole. So he needs to have enough space to do that, otherwise he's sitting in his own excrement, and I don't think any of us would like that. So that's definitely one thing that you need to make absolute certain of when you're setting up your housing. Lighting wise, UVB is beneficial. So not only have I done my own research on this, but I've spoken to exotics vets and herpetologists who just say these little frogs get MBD so easily. Something you absolutely want to avoid. So I provide Namco with a 7% jungle UVB and also an LED grow light as well for the plants. So he's got what he needs. Heating wise, he's got the Arcadia deep heat and his heat gradient is 19 to 29 degrees Celsius. So his deep heat's over here. You can see just on the mesh here. It's in a dimming stat, which you can see the probe for here. Now he's on a night-eye dimming stat, so we do have a nighttime temperature drop, which will take him down to room temps, which in the winter in this house is around 22 degrees. So it never really hits as low as 19 in here. But if you do have a cooler house, then 19 degrees is absolutely fine for the temperature drop. Feeding wise, you definitely want to give a good variety. As with any insect eating animal, feeding one is not always good enough. So what you want to do is feed a mixture. Namco gets crickets, he gets dubia roaches, he gets locusts, mealworms, and the occasional waxworm as well. He'll also get the moths from the waxworms, and he'll get the occasional fly. So definitely a good variety. Make sure you supplement with a good multivitamin and calcium as well. If you're not using D3, if you're not using UVB, you definitely want to make sure that you've got the right amount of D3 in there. But what I would recommend is just using UV. It's the right thing to do, I can promise you that. If you have an albino frog like I do, Namco is albino, what you want to do is provide diffused lighting. So the light sits over a mesh rather than inside the enclosure, and lots of plants like this so that he can sit in a shaded area. As he is currently sitting under 2 leaves there, the light is actually not touching him at its full force, so his eyes are going to be protected. If you do have a stronger UV light that isn't behind a mesh, that isn't behind plants, you can really damage their eyes and skin, so do be careful. Handling wise, I wouldn't recommend it. If you get bitten by one of these frogs, you're really going to feel it. They've got a really powerful jaw. We often joke that Namco is essentially just a big mouth on legs, which I'll show you in a second when I feed him. But if you do handle, make sure it's only when necessary. For example, moving your frog from one enclosure to another, or for a health check. But make sure you're definitely wearing gloves. Any toxic buildup on your hands, so even any residue from harsh soaps that you've used or any chemicals that you've been touching, transfers super easily through the frog's skin and can do them some serious harm. So make sure you glove up if you're going to handle. At the very least, make sure your hands have been washed with a mild soap and that you've rinsed them and they're also still a bit wet when you handle your frog. But wear gloves, essentially. You don't want to cut any corners. Provide your frog with a nice big water bowl that they can sit and soak in. Namco from time to time will have a little splash around in there. Anytime he has been in it, it's cleaned out straight afterwards, usually because he likes to poop in it. But that might just be my frog being a bit strange. But yeah, you want to make sure that you used filtered water rather than tap. Or if you do use tap water, leave it out for 24 hours so there's no longer any chlorine in there. Again, super delicate skin, lots of stuff transfers through that you don't want to, so make sure they're not coming into contact with anything harsh. Substrate wise, I use a mixture of beddings, so there's some Lucky Reptile jungle bedding, some Arcadia Earth Pro in here as well, along with a few bark chips and some moss. I spray down the enclosure every 3 days to keep the humidity between 60 and 70%. It's usually on the upper end of that, so usually in the high 60s and low 70s actually. And I feed Namco every 4 days. Overfeeding these frogs is really easy because they will just eat and eat and eat, and they will actually eat until their stomachs explode. So wouldn't recommend overfeeding your frog at all. Namco gets about 3 or 4 small insects every 4 days, and that is plenty. You can see he's not actually huge, but he's not underweight and he's not overweight either. So yeah, do make sure that you're not overfeeding your frogs. It's a really easy way to kill them young. And as I said, these frogs should live between 6 and 10 years. You're aiming for 10. So the more that you can do to help live your frog longer, the better. I will mention with the heating quick, there's always this debate about should I heat from above, should I use a heat mat? I prefer to heat from above, and I prefer to use the Arcadia Deep Heat. Go have a read about it if you want to know more. It's a great product, but if you are going to use a heat mat, please stick it to the side of the enclosure, not the bottom. It is really unnatural for an animal to dig and encounter heat as they go down. Surface temperatures are great, but if you dig to get away from heat and to thermoregulate, encountering heat below is actually extremely stressful, and I've heard about a lot of Pacman frogs dying because they've been kept with a heat mat underneath the enclosure rather than on the side. So I personally would recommend heating from above, using the Arcadia Deep Heat, which doesn't dry out the air, doesn't dry out the substrate to the same extent as a heat lamp or a ceramic does. But if you are going to go with a heat mat, stick it on the side of the enclosure rather than the bottom, and make sure you measure your temperatures well so that you're actually achieving what you need to. As far as these frogs go in general, they are really funny little pets. They're not hugely active. In fact, Namco tends to do this all day, and really just glare out of his enclosure. But when he is on the move at night time, he has a little explore. He'll jump from spot to spot and find a new place to kind of hunker down and sit and wait for food. But feeding him really is the the most exciting part of owning a Pacman frog. They have this incredible appetite, and I'm just going to mention one more thing and then we'll get to feeding. Frogs in general, especially ones that burrow, poop in their burrows and then move, as I've said already. Now, if he covers his burrow, I then have to either dig for poop or make the tank bioactive, which is why I've got these plants in here and there's a full cleanup crew in this enclosure. There are springtails, earthworms and whiteworms in here. There aren't a huge amount of wood lice in this enclosure purely because they bother him a little bit. And kind of things scurrying around him isn't the best. But you can use wood lice as well. Just watch out if your frog gets stressed or not. If they don't, fantastic. Just learn from your own animal, basically. Right, I'm going to get him some food and I will show you how he feeds. Okay, forgive me if this is a bit shaky. I'm holding it with my dodgy hand. Here we go, buddy. So you see, yeah, there's no real thinking. It's just gone. And that's the same with any size food, really. So what I do aim to do is feed him nothing wider than his own head. So he can take down large hoppers easily. He gets a pinky mouse every 3 months or something like that. So yeah, just a nice variety of food. You'll have a happy and healthy frog. Any questions, drop them in the comments below, and I will get back to you soon.